Hello and welcome to the May 2022 edition of Integrations in the News. In this particular edition, we're going to be diving into quite a few different topics. From a high level, we're going to go into data privacy and security. We're going to take a look at a specific industry and how they are consolidating using integration platform as a service and just overall integration capabilities. We're also going to be taking a look at the overall market, where it's headed, AI and machine learning, and much, much more. With that said, let's get started. Okay, so diving right into the first article here, we wanted to point out that some of the different growth projections for the iPass space are varying very significantly. So this particular article talks about the growth projection being 5.49 billion by 2028. If you recall, in some of our previous integration in the news, we cited resources that were saying it would be something like 28 billion by 2028. So a very significant difference. The main thing here, though, is overall, you can see that this space is definitely growing. And if you kind of go into the weeds on this particular article, it's also going into a lot of detail on some of the different aspects of the market and some of the different key players for some of the different key focus areas. And so there are a lot of different product types. And one of the big takeaways that we want to encourage you to look at is for your space, for your niche, and for your specific needs, you're going to want to kind of dig into reports like this and make sure that you're thinking about 3 to 5 years from now, what capabilities do you project that you're going to need? And by incorporating this into your selection process and looking at an industry-specific player that's going to be able to deliver a lot of unique value to your space, you're probably going to get the best of both worlds. And it is a very large market. We encourage you to be selective and be picky about who you end up working with in the end. Okay, with that said, the next article goes over event-driven microservices. And it just kind of talks about how this is really something that is continuing to play a part in modern architecture, in particular whenever you're integrating across multiple systems. Now, if you're not familiar with event-driven architecture and microservices, really, from a high level, this particular article gives some really nice analogies. And they're basically talking about how if you kind of look at astronomy, whenever it first came about, a lot of astronomers thought the Earth was the center of the universe. And this is kind of analogized to the idea of having monolithic systems and APIs clustered together. And what they're talking about with these microservices is a microservice would be taking a specific capability, a specific kind of API endpoint, and making it an individual service. And then having events that fire in order to cause it to trigger or for it to trigger off of events. And so this kind of bus or service bus type of model can be really effective at the enterprise level. A lot of enterprises are adopting this concept, this architectural concept of splitting out all of their different kind of APIs and integrations into microservices and leveraging events so that they can independently take advantage of these different microservices within their entire organization. This is a really powerful concept. About 61% of organizations that responded to this survey basically said they are starting to use microservices and to some extent event-driven activities or workflows. One of the other things that's pretty interesting about this article, they use another analogy, and they're basically talking about how there's choreography between these different microservices and their events. And the concept is you have a bunch of different dancers, and they can all do different things, but they are basically going to a choreographer, and they're kind of all orchestrated around a song or kind of a tune that the business needs. And really, at the end of the day, the idea here is that the business needs specific things, and those needs are going to change over time. And it really helps to make everything as modular as possible so that different parts of the organization can interact with the valuable aspects of an integration that if you complete a very monolithic set of integrations, this can be expensive to try to use later in different parts of your organization, especially as it scales and grows. So the concept of a microservice is basically, instead of having a monolith, you can have 8 specific microservices for your integration instead of just one integration platform usage. It's a really interesting concept. If you haven't kind of dug into it, this is a great article. It has a really good kind of way of explaining it that makes it easy to relate to if you haven't really gone into a lot of technical detail on it yet. Just to kind of close out on this particular article, they're also kind of talking about leveraging this event-based model at scale. And it truly is something that as you do get into the enterprise space, if your business is growing and you're moving in that direction, this is where a lot of architecture goes whenever there's a lot of enterprise and scaling, redundancy, etc., is using a service bus, using an event-driven architecture. This is very, very powerful. Okay, let's take a look at the next article now. Okay, so this one's pretty interesting. This is talking about data privacy and fallacies and some of the kind of assumptions that people tend to make around once they move to the cloud, once they put their data in the cloud, it's somehow secure. And that basically it's best practice to bring as much data in and kind of keep that data on hand. This particular article, again, the author does a great job of using some really effective analogies. And they're basically talking about how if you had to try to shoot someone with a paintball gun, would you rather shoot someone who is stationary or moving? What would be easier? And typically it's the one who's stationary. And the idea is that if you're taking a bunch of data and storing it and you don't actually need it, but you're keeping it, that makes that data a target for a hacker or someone who wants to get at that information. So if you don't have the data, if you never store it or persist it in your system, in other words, if you don't need it, don't keep it, then it lowers your risk, it lowers your footprint for being a target for some of that data. Now, a lot of different folks need secure information. And one of the big ideas as well is to tokenize the data and set up kind of multiple layers of infrastructure in between kind of the public access and the actual data storage where there's secure data. But there is a whole kind of depth of knowledge around this that's really kind of looking at essentially removing some of the sensitive data from the kind of interface layers that are close to the public interface, and really getting those kind of encrypted at rest at all times and tokenized into a vault, essentially, whenever it's really secure. So this article just kind of concludes by talking about how if you don't have the data in the first place, you're really not going to be as exposed. And if you want to avoid risk, you basically want to try to, if you're going to need data, you want to constantly audit and remove anything that you don't need later. And you also want to consider doing some kind of tokenization and essentially security on the data that's multiple levels deep, so that the exposure isn't there whenever somebody goes looking for it. Okay, so if you're interested in tokenization, as a side note, we have some really nice videos that talk about that. It's a really powerful concept. There are other ways of doing this, but the idea is encrypting the data at rest and then removing the data from the kind of public-facing layers of infrastructure. Really, really powerful technique. Pretty much all of the credit card payment gateways and payment processors use that nowadays, among other types of organizations. All right, the next article is going over basically the Nucleus Research iPass Technology Value Matrix. And basically the idea here is that the overall market has continued to grow over the last 12 months. You'll hear us talking about this probably constantly for the integration platform as a service space and just integrations overall. This is going to be a constantly growing space. One of the interesting things, though, is there's a lot of kind of movement toward low code, and you can see just some of the highlights here. Basically, low code environments simplify and reduce the overhead to enable business users to be able to make changes and make updates for their projects. This is pretty standard. There's essentially a commoditization of a lot of the basic functions and mappings, being able to run changes to workflows, etc., from a business user side of things. And then the other big thing is there's a lot of demand for AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, ML, and the ability to just kind of automate simple tasks and reduce the cost of the environment support itself. So again, just kind of enabling business users, and that's really driving a lot of value within the space. So these are relatively obvious things, But there are things that you're going to want to kind of demand and be aware of whenever you're evaluating your upcoming integration platform that you're evaluating. The last article is just kind of talking about just the concepts overall within this space. And this was a study specifically focusing on association management systems. And the summary of the article is that by adapting a integration platform in a specific space, a specific niche, we can specialize and focus on all the integrations that are in that niche, associations, and all of the disparate tools. There's a lot of fracturing with marketing tools, marketing automation, CRM, EMR, EHR, ERP, accounting, literally A to Z. If you go through your entire business, there are a lot of tools. Think about it. Think about how many different SaaS platforms you may be using. And a lot of these tools are extremely helpful and they're disruptively helpful, but they also are going to naturally tend towards splintering your execution and your data. So this article just goes on to talk about how essentially with association management systems, this particular group was able to kind of standardize some of these different API endpoints and ultimately leverage iPass to be able to bridge the gap between the different SaaS systems. Now, this is a really common theme, but it's something that you'll want to think about within your business is how can you successfully take some of these different systems and identify the frequency of use and the value, essentially build a prioritization of what integrations are going to make sense. And ideally, go ahead and start working on that so that over the next 3 to 5 years, you can actually complete all of those integrations and kind of get into a cadence of delivering on these different integrations using an integration platform, ideally with some capability for your business users to be able to manage and make updates to those integrations. If you found this video to be helpful, if you would, we would love for you to hit the like and subscribe button, and we will look forward to seeing you in the next Integrations in the News video. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.